Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us for our session today on pay transparency. My name is Jackie VanDerMeulen. I'm a partner in the Labor and Employment Group here in Toronto, but I'm joined by a cross-country panel. I have my colleague Naya Dhatt, who's joining us from our Vancouver office, and Carl Trudeau, who is joining us from our Montreal office. All three of us practice extensively in the area of pay transparency. We also work in pay equity, equitable pay laws, I would say more broadly. We have a really nice group at Fasken who all specialize in this area. So three of us have joined you here today. I'll get into some logistics before we kick off the presentation. So please bear with me, but we want to make sure that you've got all the relevant resources. I can advance my slide, I hope. If not, Andrea is going to help me, please. Oh, there we go. Okay, thank you. So while you're looking at the points here on your screen, I wanted to draw your attention in particular to the survey point. There will be a survey tab that you can complete. We really, really appreciate your feedback. I help organize all of these sessions, and I'm always looking at the feedback in particular to take out ideas for how we can improve, but also for topics that we can touch on that are relevant to your various organizations. So I do read them, I promise, and I take them to heart. So we'd appreciate any feedback you can give us on that. I also want to let you know that this is the first of several presentations that the Labor and Employment Human Rights Group at Fasken is going to be doing over the fall into December. We're up next week, I think it is, or the week after, with labor law year in review. And then after that, we've got the federal sector update, which is always a highlight. So please keep looking on our website for more information about how to register for those seminars. You can always get the materials if you can't make the session itself. Next up. Thanks. We have a packed agenda. We're going to try and keep us on time and also leave time for us to answer questions at the end. I will say in advance, thanks very much to everyone who submitted advanced questions. We've tried to incorporate them into our presentation, so they were really helpful. But if we don't get to them, we'll certainly try and get to them at the end. And if not, you can always follow up with us directly, obviously. You can find our email addresses at the end of the presentation. A few more logistics. So throughout the presentation, we have polling questions. And rest assured, we're not trying to collect confidential information. We've asked questions of the audience, and there are some instructions here on how to vote. So you've got to click on the vote button on the right-hand side of the video window in the Join the Chat bar. And on the next slide, you'll see when the poll appears, you select your response. And don't worry, they're all in this sort of format of yes, no, unsure. We're not collecting this data. It's really just, and it's all going to be anonymized. But as we do the presentation, we're curious to hear from all of you to what extent your organization already has certain practices in place that relate to this topic. So we'd appreciate if you could share your insights with the rest of the folks participating. Excuse me. Okay, so we'll do a test question now just to get us started. Next slide, there we go. So what day is it today? And if all of you who are participating can test it out, see if you can find oh, there we go. We have some responses starting to come in. So at least some of you are paying attention. Thank you. It's a good sign. And some of you know which day it is too, which is also a great sign. And while we test that out, and please keep going if you haven't figured it out already, we'll move to the next slide. Because what we want to do at the outset of this presentation is talk a little bit about what pay transparency is and what it's not. So we'll start off with another poll question for you to help tee up this discussion. So does your organization include compensation information in its public job postings as an existing practice today? We're curious to hear from you. And at least my personal perception is that certainly in some professional roles, we tend to see at least ranges, but not always. And I think that's bearing out actually in the test results as they're coming in, which is really interesting. It's almost a 50-50, well, 45-45 split. And I'm losing my voice already. I'm sorry. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, in some places, it is going to be legislated now that you actually have to. In other places, it's not yet, but it's part of what we see as sort of a growing trend generally around this topic of pay transparency. So as the results are still coming in, I'll switch to the next slide, Andrea, please. So what is pay transparency? Well, public postings of job or compensation expectations in a public job posting, for example, that's certainly part of it. But more broadly, what we tend to see this concept encompass is really just the practice of openly sharing information about compensation. It can also very much include, though, data transparency. So sometimes, but not always, it refers to the practice of sharing broader data about your organization and your employees and what, in fact, they're making, not just what they can anticipate making in a job posting. Typically, or not typically, I guess, but sometimes we also see pay transparency refer to the practice of prohibiting employers from asking about compensation history. Next slide, please. So we're also curious to hear from you whether your organization, as of today, tracks information about pay gaps, whatever that may mean to your organization, for equity-seeking groups, whether that's based on gender, race, sexual orientation, etc. And I'm not surprised that most don't, is at least my sort of anecdotal experience, although we do see quite a few who do. For some employers, and we'll talk about that, Carl will talk about that in a moment. For some employers, for example, in the federal sector, there are statutory obligations to track pay gaps for equity-seeking groups. In most jurisdictions, though, we don't have that, but I do see employers taking proactive steps more and more to actually do that. And a lot are using that data, too, to try and make adjustments, again, proactively, without any statutory obligation to correct what they perceive as potential pay gaps based on sort of inadvertent biases in their organization for individuals in those equity-seeking groups. So in general, I've seen just a real uptick in this area, not so much of law, I guess, but of practice amongst employers and organizations. So I'm impressed to see actually that it looks like roughly 35% or so of organizations participating today do. Next slide, please. Whenever we talk about pay transparency, inevitably the question comes up, is that the same as pay equity? And at a really high level, it's not. Obviously, these concepts are all related and interact with each other. But what is pay equity? And that was really the topic of what could be a week-long seminar. But pay equity refers to the practice of examining your compensation practices more generally to equal pay for work of equal value. So taking a really simplistic example, if the organization values clerical work as much as it values forklift operator work, are they, on average, are those jobs, not the individuals, but are the jobs compensated equally, given that they're valued equally by the organization? That's a really simple example, and it obviously gets a lot more complicated the more compensation structures and the more jobs you put into that mix. But that's what pay equity refers to. It's really about reducing the systemic discrimination that has existed in our societies more broadly, not with any one employer, but with societies against women's work, quote unquote, making sure that it's seen, valued, and compensated equally. But it doesn't refer necessarily to pay transparency and sort of making that information about those pay practices more visible to the broader employee population. That's more pay transparency. Who has actual pay equity legislation or legislated obligations in Canada? Well, it's employers in the federal sector. That's fairly new. A lot of employers, Carl and I in particular, are very busy working in the federal sector with employers on that topic. But you also have employers in Quebec and Ontario who have proactive pay equity legislation. In the public sector, many employers across, I think it's most provinces at this stage, also have pay equity legislation. Next slide, please. again, just making sure we've all got the terminology correct at the outset, and then we'll get into the meat of the presentation. But what about equal pay for equal work? Well, that's, again, a little bit of a different topic. That's more about ensuring that two individuals who do the same work are paid the same, unless there is a sort of legitimate reason for paying them differently. Legitimate meaning not based on a prohibited ground of discrimination, such as gender. So where it's based on a seniority system or a merit system, that's a valid reason for paying two people differently, despite the fact that they're doing equal work, but other factors are not. And we see that in employment standards legislation in many provinces, and obviously in human rights legislation. Next slide, please. What we take away from all of these various different areas of law, though, is that it's certainly an area on the uptick, in that there's increasing both employee attention to the issue, there's increasing public scrutiny in the issue. We're starting to see it even in, for example, securities reporting. We're tracking the rate at which employers are disclosing in their securities filings their equitable pay practices. We're seeing an increased complaints. We're seeing an increased legislative action by various governments. So it's an area where I think a lot of employers are now changing their practices, both because they must in order to comply with legislation, but also to ensure that they're being responsive to, again, those broader pressures from employees and their customers, the public, et cetera, their shareholders. With that, I will turn it over to Carl to tell us a little bit about the federal sector.
Of course. Thank you, Jackie. And more specifically, we'll focus on the Employment Equity Act. And we can exactly move on to this slide, and which applies, as Jackie mentioned a bit earlier, to private sector, so federally regulated employers of the private sector, and more specifically those that count 100 employees or more. And although that act has been in force and applicable since the 80s, 1986 precisely, it's undergone various changes since. And one very recent that I'll cover in a moment is regarding pay transparency. And before we move on to the pay transparency, the new obligations per se, I'll provide a brief background on employment equity. And essentially, it focuses on 4 designated groups. So women, Indigenous people, persons with disabilities, and members of racialized groups. And for those 4 designated groups, there are various actions that private sector employers must take. And I'll provide a high-level summary before we move on to pay transparency. But essentially, they must assess the level of representation of the 4 designated groups within the organization, which implies collecting data and analyzing the statistics and the workforce. There's also a review of the employment systems, policy, and practices that must be undertaken and that's to identify if there are barriers for the people in those 4 designated groups. So, for example, are there any barriers in terms of hiring, promotion, access to positions, and so forth? And the last action item, and which I'll focus on, is the annual reporting, because since January 2021. There have been changes that are in trending towards pay transparency. So in terms of process, in the annual reporting that's due June 1st of every year, now employers are asked for more salary data. And for example, for each of the 4 designated groups, there's data that's required on hourly rates, bonus rates, overtime hours, and so forth. And the goal of that is to compare for the 4 designated groups with the rest of the workforce. And a more detailed breakdown then is done with the different positions level. So senior managers, the managers, professionals, clerical employees. So that's the annual reporting that must be conducted by the employer and filed with ESDC and in June of each year. Then where the pay transparency comes into play is that ESDC conducts some reporting and publishes data based on those annual reports. We could change slides. Thanks so much. So it's not the report per se that is published, but only the gaps, the wage gaps that have been identified. So general data, for example, and I'll go more in details on what's accessible to the public, but essentially it's wage gap, for example, on the hourly rates. And you can compare, for example, women occupying senior manager roles against the rest of the workforce in the same level of positions. And again, it's not the hourly rate per se, or the bonus rates or overtime hours that are published, but really the gap between the designated group and the rest of the workforce. Again, we can switch slides, please. And as mentioned in the PowerPoint, that the salary data reported by employers is used to report. And on the next slide, we have an example of. We can switch again. Here, thanks so much. The equivision of what it looks like. So, the public can access to the information published by ESDC, whether general trends across the board, but there's also an option to search by companies that have filed their reports. So any employer that have filed the report, there's access for the public in terms of the wage gaps that I just talked about, whether hourly rates, bonus rates, overtime hours, and so forth. And the goal of that, when making the changes to the law, was a purpose of transparency, but also that employers have a closer focus on those wage gaps that can occur or that can exist between the designated groups and the rest of the workforce, or for encouraging proactivity in this regard.
Carl, while we're
yes.
on this slide, I just wanted to point out one little thing, that if you look at that little I there, it says pay gap contextual information. And if you're a federal sector employer, you probably know that you're allowed to submit I think it's 500 characters or something, explanation that accompanies your annual employment equity report. Well, rest assured that it does show up, but it's really hard to find. So you've got to click on there to actually get that additional context that employers are providing. But it's there.
It's a good point. I have the perspective of someone that actually actively looking, but you're right that there's research to be done to finally access that data and the wage gaps per se. And that brings me to additional changes. And again, that's been enforced since January 1st of 2021. And so was applied for the first time in the summer of 2022 for the first report that where the changes were applicable. And with that came record keeping requirements, because since the report is quite specific in terms of the compensation data to provide, there are stricter obligations now to maintain records. So, for example, salary of employees. Again, it focused on bonus pay, overtime pay, the period over which the data was collected, the number of hours worked attributed to a salary, so that there's a list of thorough information that must be kept by the employer with the amended regulations. There are some upcoming changes that are currently being discussed. In spring of 2023, a report was released with recommendations for changes to be made to the Employment Equity Act. Later, at the end of 2023, the federal government then announced that there were commitments to modernize the Employment Equity Act. So, for example, creating new designated groups, namely Black people and 2S LGBTQI plus people. There are also modernization of terms in the law. For example, changing Aboriginal peoples with Indigenous peoples, and other adaptation with other laws. Very lately, there's been a consultation period that closed on July 31st, 2024, and we're waiting now for changes to be implemented by the budget law. And then that completes on the employment equity overview that we wanted to share.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be taking you through the requirements of the BC Pay Transparency Act. So this legislation has been in force since May of last year, and it applies to provincially regulated employers only. It was enacted for the purpose of reducing the gender pay gap in BC, which is among the highest in Canada. And there are three main components of the Act that I'll be taking you through today. The first being pay transparency in job postings, which I'm sure that a fair number of you are going to be familiar with. The second requirement is pay history and prohibition on reprisals. And the third is pay transparency reporting. So the first requirement here, pay transparency on job postings, essentially requires employers, not just in BC, but if you're an employer that's provincially regulated, even outside of BC, if you are posting a public job posting that is available to BC residents or could ever be filled by a BC resident, either remotely or in person, you are expected under the Pay Transparency Act to advertise the salary or the wage that's associated with that posting, or the salary or wage range that you expect that you're going to be paying for that posting. And I've provided here an example for the types of language that is okay and isn't okay. So you have to be quite specific in the pay information that you post. You can't say that the wage is going to be starting at $20 or $20 and up. You've got to post either a specific wage, $20 an hour, or $50,000 a year, or a wage range, a salary range. There's no requirement at this time to disclose other details of the global compensation package on your public job postings, but we are seeing that some employers are opting to include that information to make the total compensation more attractive to job applicants and to attract higher quality applicants that way. There's also currently no guidance on how large the wage or salary range that you need to post on job postings can be. So what we're seeing is that some employers are being a little bit more restrictive in the ranges that they post. It might be $50,000 to $55,000 a year. Some are posting extremely large ranges. The largest one that I've seen is $100,000 to $200,000 a year, depending on the person's experience and qualifications. And that isn't going to be non-compliant unless you are expecting, for example, only to be paying maybe somewhere between $100,000 and $130,000, but you've posted this large range, and then it becomes misleading. So long as you're expecting to pay something within that range, that is going to be compliant with the law. Applicants are able to negotiate a higher pay than is advertised in the job posting, and nothing in the Act prohibits them from doing that. And nothing in the Act prohibits you from paying somebody more than what you post in your job posting. It's just an expectation of what you're thinking that you're going to be paying for the posting. Actually, I want to go back for a second because one point that I do want to touch on is some of the practical issues that we've been experiencing or that employers have been experiencing in posting pay transparency on job postings. And one of those, the concerns have been that this is now increasing the conversations that people are having to have internally with existing employees about, hey, I saw your job posting. It pays $50,000 a year, but I'm only being paid $45,000 a year for the same position, and I've been here for 5 years. So these kinds of uncomfortable conversations are starting to come up, and that is the purpose of the legislation, is to essentially open up the conversation on pay transparency within your existing workforce and among new applicants, so that they have a little bit more power to discuss their compensation. But one of the ways that employers have been dealing with the kind of fallout, the implications of this, is posting ranges that, they're reflective of what the employer is expecting to pay, but that aren't so specific that employees can kind of look at them and go, oh, I'm jumping to the conclusion that you are going to be paying someone higher than what I'm being paid. Okay, so the next portion of the Act that we'll be talking about is pay history and prohibition on reprisals. So one of the requirements of the Act is that employers cannot seek pay history information from job applicants by any means, including from third parties, unless that information is publicly available to you. And the second component of this is that you cannot impose any negative consequences on an employee for exercising their rights under the Pay Transparency Act, whether that means that they're making inquiries about how much they're being paid, if they're discussing their pay with other employees in your workforce or with job applicants, if they're making inquiries about your pay transparency report or what actions you're taking to comply with your obligations under the Act, or if they report you to the Director of Pay Transparency for not complying with the Act, you cannot dismiss them, suspend, demote, any of the negative consequences. And the final component of the Act is pay transparency reporting. And this is the one that I think is probably the most misunderstood and the one that is the most labor intensive in terms of complying with it. So what this requires is that reporting employers are having to prepare a publicly available pay transparency report by November 1st of each year. What the date that the first report is going to be due and whether or not your organization even has to prepare a pay transparency report depends on your size. So this past November 1st, 2024, employers that had 1,000 or more employees in BC were to prepare and then post their first pay transparency report. And then by next year, employers that have 300 to 999 employees in BC by January 1st, 2025, will need to publish their first pay transparency reports. And then the number decreases to 50 or more employees in BC in 2026. And after 2026, the government is still considering the kind of minimum size that an employer needs to be in order to be required to prepare a pay transparency report. But it'll be a number that is less than 49 and a number to be decided. And one thing that I'd like to point out is that to determine the number of employees that you have for pay transparency reporting purposes and to determine whether you're required to report and when you're required to report, employees in BC is going to include BC residents, but it can also include BCs that don't live in BC if they have a significant enough connection to BC. I won't get into the particulars of that because it can get quite complicated and it's a pretty specific analysis, but I just wanted to flag for you that that number could include people that don't actually live in BC. So getting a little bit more now into what the the kind of contents of pay transparency reports are and some of the nuances. You are required to collect the information that is included in the pay transparency regulation. It's very specific in the contents of pay transparency reports. And at a high level, you need to ask employees what their gender is, whether that's male, female, non-binary, or unknown, and then report differences in your employees' pay and hours worked between the categories of man, woman, non-binary, and unknown. And your existing employees should have the opportunity to provide that information about gender at least once a year. And new employees should be given the opportunity to provide that information during the onboarding process. And employees, participation in pay transparency reports is voluntary. So employees can decide that they don't want to provide their gender information for the purposes of the pay transparency report, and they should be permitted, to make that decision and be able to opt in or opt out of that by contacting their employer. And they should be permitted to change their gender information for the purposes of pay transparency reporting at any time. Another thing to note is that the information that you're collecting should be collected in accordance with privacy legislation. So you should be seeking, again, consent to use people's gender information for the purposes of pay transparency reporting, and you should not be using that information for purposes other than that report. And then the requirement is that you need to publish the completed report on your public website. So you cannot just post it internally on your intranet. That isn't compliant with the Act. It needs to be accessible to the public. There is no requirement, though, for employers to submit the pay transparency report to the government. So one of the key points that I want to highlight, because it's something that's often confused, is that there's a difference between gender and sex data. So the Pay Transparency Act requires you to collect gender data from your employees and then to use that to compile your pay transparency report. Gender, according to the Gender and Sex Data Standard published by the province of BC, refers to someone's self-identified sense of self. And those categories for the purposes of the Pay Transparency Act are that they're a man, they're woman, they're non-binary, or that they fall into the unknown category. The unknown category includes people who are not sure about their gender, they don't identify as being a man, woman, or non-binary, or they prefer, not to be included in the pay transparency report. Sex, on the other hand, refers to your sex that's assigned to you at birth and is based on physical characteristics such as hormones and your reproductive system. And those categories are often male, female, intersex, or you can prefer not to say, or unknown. So the Pay Transparency Act, as I've mentioned, requires the collection of gender data, and it requires it in the specific categories of man, woman, non-binary, and unknown. I've had a lot of questions about whether employers can just use the sex data that they have from employees, such as male, female, and convert it into the gender data that's required by the Pay Transparency Act. And the answer to that is no, because you can't convert sex data into gender data, because you're making the assumption that someone who identifies as being a male then also identifies as being a man, when the circumstances could be that they actually identify their gender as being woman or non-binary or some other gender that is not in those categories, or that they prefer not to say, or that they haven't made up their mind yet. You should be able to give employees the opportunity to update or change that information at least once a year, but ideally at any time. So this right here is a sample pay transparency report. This one is from BC Housing. It was prepared last year. And this would have been one of the first reports to come out, which BC Crown corporations were required to release last year. You'll see that it's quite simple. Once you've collected the information about the different people in the different gender categories and information on their hourly pay, overtime and overtime hours, and then the percentage of each gender in each pay quartile, it's quite simple to compile the report. And the BC government does have a pay transparency tool that you can use to generate your report. That's accessible on their website, and you do need a BC ID to be able to access that report or that tool if you'd like to report that way. But it is fairly simple to just kind of plug in the different data that you have for your organization, and it generates for you a report that looks something like this. One thing to keep in mind is that you're not submitting the report to the government if you use that tool, but technically it could be accessible to the government. But again, that doesn't necessarily matter because these reports are going to be public anyways. So I'd recommend that if you're struggling with generating something like this, that you take a look at that tool and see if it might be right for your organization. So these are some of the practical issues with reporting that I've seen coming out now that the deadline has just passed for the first pay transparency reports for employers with 1,000 or more employees in BC. Those reports, by the way, if you'd like to see, should now be available on companies' public websites for you to review those, if they're helpful to you in determining your own kind of action with respect to the Pay Transparency Act and how you're going to be approaching the reporting. But the biggest problem that I saw was that in order to comply with the Pay Transparency Act, companies need to collect gender information from their employees for the purposes of reporting, because you can't assume that everyone is going to want to opt in to participating in the pay transparency reporting, and you can't assume that the existing information you have about people's sex or gender is going to be the information that they'd want to provide to you for the purposes of pay transparency reporting. So the response rates to many of the surveys that companies did to collect this gender information was quite low, in some cases low as 8%. And this skews the data that is to be included in the report, and it creates misleading results. Sometimes even completely flipping the results. If a company had really low response rates and their pay transparency report based on gender shows that there's this giant gap in genders between what they're paid for hourly or for overtime. In some cases, when companies were to take that same kind of pay information and compile a report based on their sex data that they already had, the results were completely opposite. There was almost no gender pay gap, or in that case, sex pay gap in their company. So that is an issue, because if the purpose of the act is to kind of make people more empowered in terms of knowing what the pay gap is in their organizations, and then to kind of empower companies to change their approach to compensation, then the data really should reflect, what it's supposed to be reflecting. But to address this issue of low response rates, skewing data, some companies have chosen to, I'd say a lot of companies have chosen to include an explanatory note in their pay transparency reports, explaining that there was a low response rate in their organization to their survey, and this has skewed the data. Some companies have chosen to report sex data instead of gender data, which is contrary to the legislation, which does require gender data. It's also contrary in the fact that if you're using employee sex data, they've not necessarily consented to you using it for pay transparency purposes, and they have not been given, the option to opt in or out of the pay transparency reporting. And some organizations are reporting using both their gender data that they compiled and then their sex data as well. This is still contrary to the legislation, but they're making more of an effort there to comply with the legislation.
Naya, do you think that a lot of the low self-reporting is because this sort of snuck up on employers in a lot of ways, that they kind of, at least I know from hearing from other employers, that they weren't necessarily aware of the obligations to report this year, or they weren't prepared, they didn't have the infrastructure in place, so they didn't have kind of that lead up time to develop a good communication plan to employees?
I think that's definitely a big part of it. There were employers who even big employers that have quite a few resources to be able to kind of understand the legislation and put in place the infrastructure to meet these obligations had trouble with it. And it's because this is very, very new in our province. And employers are having to kind of learn what exactly applying all of this stuff means and how their employees are going to respond to it. But I think another big piece of the information or of the picture is that employees aren't understanding what the purpose of this legislation is and why it's important to be engaged in the survey and to respond to the survey. What I also heard was that more women were responding to the survey than men because they're more invested in closing the gender pay gap than perhaps men are. And of course, that's not the case everywhere, but in some cases, that is what happened. So all of those factors together, I think, are just kind of resulting in a lower response rate. Another one, though, is with certain workforces. If you're in construction, for example, or if you're a unionized workforce in a factory, it's difficult to kind of figure out the best way to collect information about employees' genders. Do you put just kind of like a survey with someone's pay stub, and how do they return it to you? All of these different logistical issues were coming up. So I'm hopeful that next year employers will kind of have learned a little bit and be able to develop a better strategy to get better data. But I do think that a lot of these problems are going to continue to persist.
And we had a question from the audience, actually, that we have a few, which some of which we'll get to at the end, but one I thought might be helpful for you to address now, which is how often are these reports going to be updated? So for those who just submitted or who did their report this year, is it an annual update that they have to do?
It is. Okay. So it is an annual report, and employers are required to provide their existing employees the opportunity at least once a year to update their gender information for the purposes of pay transparency reporting. And new employers are required to, new employees must be asked the question about what their gender is and if they're wanting to kind of opt into providing that information for the purposes of the pay transparency report.
And my understanding it's for all employees, whether they're part-time, full-time, casual. Is that right? Or are there any?
So it's there's no distinction made in the Pay Transparency Act between different categories of employees like that. It's just whether or not you have the threshold number of employees in BC.
Yep. Thank you.
Of course, happy to answer any questions that anybody has at the end of the presentation if I haven't gotten to them quite yet. So I think the big question that people ask and what's on their minds is what happens if I don't comply with my obligations under the Pay Transparency Act and regulation? And the answer to that right now is that there's not a whole lot of I'd say teeth to the legislation at this point, because there's not a real enforcement mechanism in the legislation to date. There's no power for the Director of Pay Transparency at this time to investigate employers, to issue any orders that employers comply with the legislation, or to issue any fines or penalties. And there's no the Director of Pay Transparency is not at this time naming or shaming employers that don't comply with the legislation. So the focus right now from the Director of Pay Transparency is on educating employers on what their obligations are under the law and why those obligations are important. And the intention is that once employers are able to understand those obligations and understand what's required of them under the law, that they will be complying. But it's important to note that the lack of enforcement mechanism could change. For example, in Newfoundland, there's a fine of up to $25,000 for companies that don't comply with the Pay Equity and Pay Transparency Act in that jurisdiction. The other implication is that if you're not complying with your obligations under the legislation, then your employees job applicants and the public can all make reports to the Director of Pay Transparency about your non-compliance. And in those cases, what is likely to happen is that the Director of Pay Transparency would contact you and remind you of your obligations, with the hope that you will then, begin complying with the legislation. But again, because of the lack of powers to enforce the legislation, I think that some employers are not perhaps taking their obligations as seriously as they should be, given that this is the law in British Columbia. There's also a risk of claims associated with this legislation that are possible under other associated legislation. So, for example, under the Human Rights Code, if an employee were to report a different gender other than their perceived gender and experience adverse treatment because that gender information wasn't adequately protected by human resources, that could be the genesis for a human rights complaint against your organization. Another piece of legislation that's important here is the Personal Information Protection Act, which requires you to collect, use, and disclose gender information for the purpose that you collected it for and in compliance with that legislation. And essentially have safeguards to protect the information that employees are providing to you. And with that, I will pass it on back to Jackie to talk about pay transparency in Ontario.
Thanks, Naya. And as you were talking about the BC framework, I was sort of reflecting on the fact that all of this is a great laudable goal. We want to reduce the gender wage gap, and there have been lots of legislative attempts in different ways to try and do that. None of them seem to be really working to get that kind of last 15-20% closed. But I think from the employer perspective, we can all agree with the goal, but it opens up a lot of landmines for employers. Like there's the public relations implications now of having this report posted that may not paint a really accurate picture, particularly if your data is not accurate. There are also lots of good reasons why employers are going to pay people differently that are totally unrelated to their gender, but that you often see certain groups like. Just anyway, you see a whole lot of other issues, right? That you can't explain in a little explainer note. I know in the federal context, what we saw when the first pay transparency reports went out, in addition to that explainer note that you get the one line that you have to research for, as Carl said on the page, a lot of employers were really proactive about getting messages out to their employees, explaining what the purpose was after the data had already been collected, explaining what the purpose was of the report, that it's going to come out, what it shows, what it doesn't show, and then really emphasizing all of the other activities to reduce the wage gap within the organization to the extent it exists.
And I'll just add that in reviewing some of the pay transparency reports that have been coming out in BC just over the past couple of days, there have been organizations that are adding explainer notes kind of throughout their pay transparency report to explain why certain pay gaps are there. For example, that there are more men in the most senior roles in the organization than there are women, and that is the reason that the gender pay gap is currently there. And some organizations are speaking about their efforts to date on addressing the gender pay gap and their efforts moving forward as well.
Yeah, that's it. That it's like so much of this is also a societal issue that it's taking a while to work its way through the system. But the messaging can really get lost, or the sort of what you interpret from the data can get lost if you don't have this accompanying message to employees who are very likely to go on and look at the results. So it's almost like every organization now needs a team of folks who are working on these projects, because we're seeing so many more of them. And then in BC, you've got all the privacy considerations too about how you collect this data properly and protect it. So a lot on employers' shoulders. Turning to Ontario, sorry. So I'm going to start with what is not the law. And I raise this because we do actually have a Pay Transparency Act in Ontario, but it's not in force. So it was brought, if you Google Pay Transparency Act, you'll find it on e-laws and elsewhere on the internet. It was brought into force, or it was enacted by the former Liberal government in Ontario. But before they could bring it into force, there was a change of government, and the Conservatives haven't brought this into force. We don't expect them to, in part because of what I'll tell you on the next slide in a moment, which is their response instead, a little bit different version of pay transparency. What the Pay Transparency Act actually does is somewhat similar to the BC model. So it included a lot of the same features about prohibiting asking candidates about their compensation history, pay transparency reporting, and no reprisal provisions. But again, not in force right now. If we see a change of government again, it is something, if we see a Liberal government come in, we may see this come back on the books. So I just want to flag for everyone that it is there, but not currently in force. On the next slide, and I'll do it if, Andrea, can you help me? If not, then there we go. Thank you very much. So we do have, as I mentioned, the current Conservative government's response, which is to actually amend the existing employment standards legislation rather than do a standalone pay transparency legislation. So as part of their series of amendments to the Working for Workers legislation that amends various employment standards in Ontario, the fourth edition proposes to introduce various types of pay transparency provisions. They're not in force yet. We don't know, unfortunately, when they will be brought into force. It's going to be on a date to be proclaimed. We do anticipate they will be brought into force, though. We've seen this with many of the changes under the Working for Workers legislation, that they're staggered over time. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what are the Ontario requirements going to be? So they're going to also include the requirement to have pay transparency on public job postings. So public job postings, what does that mean? Well, we don't exactly know yet. It's going to be defined in regulation. Some of that's going to be obvious, your public postings on various websites, but obviously there could be some nuance there. So we'll keep an eye out for that as the regulations are developed. What you are going to have to include, though, in your public job posting is either the expected compensation or, like in BC, a range of compensation. Again, we don't know how range of compensation is going to be defined or interpreted, but taking it at face value for the moment, probably like BC, we can assume that as long as you're giving a reasonable range that can actually be expected to be earned by the candidate, that would be applicable. But again, more to come. There's also, and this is not so much pay transparency, but it's included in the same bucket of amendments, is a prohibition on requirements relating to Canadian work experience. Arguably, that may already be covered by human rights legislation in Ontario, but now there's going to be an explicit prohibition in employment standards legislation, so a bit of a different enforcement mechanism and more explicit. Oh, sorry, Andrea, can you go back for a second? Thank you. But that's a new component as well that we're going to see as part of these changes. The last one is, again, not typical pay transparency, not really pay transparency at all, but all lumped in with these changes to job postings, is required disclosure of the use of AI, where it's used to screen, assess, or select applicants for the position. So employers are now going to have to proactively disclose where AI is used in the recruitment and selection process, which is interesting. Next slide, please, because I think I'm turning it over to Carl. Thanks, Carl.
Yes, for other jurisdiction. So we can already move to the next slides. Before I address Newfoundland and Labrador, and we'll see most trends are in the Eastern Canada. The question we get frequently is for Quebec. If there are any updates, upcoming pay transparency legislation, and to this date, there are no announced legislation or any ongoing discussion about such a law. We can see a global trend and in Canada as well. And also, generally speaking, the trends tend to follow from federal to Quebec or among Canadian provinces. So future will tell. If the government will eventually work on a Pay Transparency Act or amendment to the Labor Standards Act in Quebec, but for now there's no announcement. So moving on to Newfoundland and Labrador, I'll provide just a high-level overview because it's very similar to what applies in BC. And what's also what was covered for Ontario. So, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador, the act was passed, but not enforced yet, so not yet applicable. But it covers similar obligations and restrictions. So, for example, not asking candidates about previous pay history, that the expected pay or pay range must be public and posted in the job posting, the prohibition against protection against reprisals, and the Pay Transparency annual report. So we can see that from province to province, there's a great similarity between the acts. And we can move to the next slide, please. And same for Prince Edward Island, where actually the Employment Standards Act include some provisions which are similar to what we just discussed. The expected pay or pay range, that's for the public job posting, prohibition against asking an applicant's past salary or the salary history. And also the prohibition to prevent employees. That's an interesting one. You can prohibit employees talking among each other about their wages. Other upcoming pieces of legislation for Nova Scotia. Right now, it's on hold, but there's a Pay Equity and Transparency Act that contains similar obligations and restrictions for employers. And we can move to the next slide. New Brunswick has a Pay Equity Act to public service employers. Finally proposed in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but voted down. So that's a development we haven't seen in the other provinces so far where it's been presented. So we wanted to provide a general landscape of what's coming, and we see it's mostly in the east of Canada. And we can move on with my colleague Naya for more global and international trends.
So internationally, I'd say that there is a trend towards pay transparency and pay equity. And I won't get into too much detail on each of these jurisdictions, but I'm kind of providing you a brief overview here of what is going on in the US, UK, and the EU. So in the US, a lot of states now have pay transparency laws, including California, New York, New Jersey, Colorado, Illinois, Nevada, Maryland, Hawaii, and more. And in California, the requirement is that employers with 15 or more employees have to include the pay range in their job postings. New York is quite similar to BC in that employers must disclose their salary or wage range for jobs that may be filled or will be filled in New York City, including for remote jobs. And in New York, employers must disclose the salary range in postings for internal promotions or transfer opportunities. I just answered a question in the chat about whether in BC you're also required to post the pay information in job postings for internal postings. And the answer to that is no, that the Act does not prescribe that. But you may be asked by your employees what the pay information is that is associated with that internal posting, given that the trend is towards increased disclosure for compensation in BC. In Illinois, employers with 15 or more employees must provide pay ranges and the benefits information on all job postings, and that is as of January in this coming year. In the UK, they've had the Equality Act since 2010, which provides for pay equity. It provides that men and women should receive equal pay for equal work. And then since 2017, there's been a requirement that large employers with 250 or more employees must report on their gender pay gap. And there is currently new legislation in the works that, if passed, this is the Equality, Race, and Disability Bill. If that passes, it would require employers with 250 plus employees to also report on the ethnicity and disability pay gap in their organizations. And there's also a requirement in the UK that certain listed companies are required to report on their executive pay. Now, moving on to the European Union here, there is a directive from the EU that came out last year on pay equity and pay transparency. And this is, so it is in force as of June of last year, but member states have 3 years until 2026 to implement this directive. And there's three main components, but this is definitely a very high level summary because it's certainly a lot more detailed than this. The first requirement is pay transparency. So employers will need to show the initial pay or pay range for a job to potential job applicants. And they've got to make the criteria that they use to determine the pay setting and the pay progression of that job easily accessible. They've got to post jobs in a gender neutral way, and employees can request written information on their pay level and their average pay level for workers that are doing the same work. So this is quite a bit further than we've gotten in BC or really anywhere in Canada. But I would not be surprised if over the next several years, we started to see some of this kind of approach make its way over into Canada. There's also a component here that employers cannot ask job applicants about their current or former salary. This is, again, aligned with the approach in BC. And pay reporting, employers will need to report on the gender pay gap, much like we're seeing in BC, and kind of other jurisdictions in BC are starting to think about this as well. And that brings us now to the practical consideration section, and I'll hand it over again to Jackie.
Thanks very much, Naya. A lot to think about. And again, those practical considerations from the public relations perspective, the employee relations, shareholder relations. What I've noticed in the past few years is sort of increasing attention by the C-suite on these issues, where before it was sort of considered solely within the domain of human resource professionals. But I think because of the potential employee relations and public relations scrutiny that comes to these issues, that now the C-suite are starting to, take a lot more interest because of the potential reputational issues. So turning to some of the practical considerations, there's at a high level, like a very much increased awareness in public discourse of these issues, in employee expectations. Obviously, there's the legal landscape, and we've talked about throughout this presentation, there are increasing legal obligations on employers, but even where those legal obligations aren't there, I think it's having an impact on all employers, really, because of the sort of, again, the increased awareness of employees and expectations that employees can ask about compensation information, that it's not secretive anymore, and that they have a right to know and discuss that compensation with their colleagues. All challenges, because there are obviously, again, good reasons why you may not want those conversations happening in your workplace. In general, though, I do think we see a trend towards more disclosure by employers in order to be able to keep up with the market expectations and really attract quality candidates to roles. We want to do a poll here as well, for those of you who are still with us. Does your organization use a job evaluation tool? And by job evaluation tool, I mean a tool that measures typically skill, effort, responsibility, working conditions, but it could measure other things, but really to give a value to jobs within your organization. And I'm actually surprised with how many I'm seeing say yes, they do, because I certainly see it in some organizations, particularly larger organizations, although sometimes larger organizations have the challenge, particularly where they've grown large because they've amalgamated or acquired other entities over time, it can be really hard to standardize compensation practices, including job evaluation tools. But I'm still really impressed with how many organizations already have a job evaluation tool. And I think, why are we talking about job evaluation tools? Not because we sell job evaluation tools at Fasken. We don't. We work with employers often to sort of understand them and make sure that they're applied in non-discriminatory ways, that they incorporate all the relevant factors. It's a huge part of our work in pay equity, for example. But it also comes into the pay transparency discussion when we start thinking about best practices. So I'm going to the next slide, maybe. There we go. Part of what we're really seeing is pressure, both from, again, the legislative context, but also employee expectation context, towards a standardization of compensation practices. And we haven't even really touched on pay equity today, but those pressures too certainly push towards standardization of compensation practices, including the use of job evaluation tools to develop standardized salary ranges or compensation bands. Part of the challenge is, as you're more transparent about your pay practices, the more you have individuals who have bespoke compensation packages and bespoke compensation arrangements, the more employees point to one element of those packages and say, well, I want that too. And it starts creating, obviously, retention issues, morale issues, potentially legal issues too, if the difference between those individuals is based on a prohibited ground of discrimination. So we do tend to see more work towards standardization. Employers working with compensation experts in the field. I mean, there are a whole host of them, whether it's Mercer or KPMG or whatever it might be, who are out there who work with employers to look at more broadly how they can bring a more systemic approach to compensation. We do see inadvertently or maybe on purpose, that it also does have the impact of reducing potential wage gaps or pay equity issues as employers go through that process. Again, I don't think it's, for the vast majority of employers, I don't think it's intentional, but certainly we do see biases, whether it's gender biases or racial biases or whatever other biases everyone brings to the table, factor into compensation where there's a lot of discretion. So the more we see sort of fixed compensation and standardized compensation practices, the less we tend to see in general of systemic discrimination creeping in. That comes in with bonuses as well. Bonuses and other sort of incentives and things like that, where you've got a lot of managerial discretion to make decisions, we tend to see more issues coming up that then through pay transparency become apparent to employees. The next point we have on the slide is proceeding with caution when asking candidates about their compensation history. In some provinces, it's not yet prohibited. As Naya said, in BC, it is now. It's still, again, something that even where it's not prohibited, we see candidates really balk at being asked that question. It almost feels like personal information now. There may be certain situations where it makes sense to ask those questions, but again, just proceed with caution when you're doing that. I think the landscape and employee expectations on that front are really changing. The other thing is always keeping in mind when you're collecting this information, that it could be personal information. And so for those of you who work in provinces with privacy legislation, you've got to be particularly careful about how you collect and store and use any personal information that you're gathering from your employees. What about sharing or like prohibiting employees from sharing confidential information about their salary, for example? So I've seen it go both ways. And we had an interesting discussion amongst the three of us on this exact point, because as Naya said, in BC now that's going to be prohibited. You can't prohibit employees from making requests and discussing their compensation information. In other provinces, that's not a legal obligation. And in fact, the opposite. We often see employers put in their employment contracts a specific prohibition on sharing compensation information with other employees, because again, there are a whole host of reasons why employers might pay employees differently. It can create real morale issues if they start talking and comparing. So each employer is going to have to make their own decision, obviously, based on their legal obligations, but also the mood or employee expectations in their industry. If you've got really standardized compensation practices, then maybe it's not something you have to consider. If you don't, and there are good reasons why you don't, then maybe it is something that it may be a tool that employers still use. With that, I think we're going to leave a little bit of time for questions. I know I have a few that have come in. But I want to thank my co-panelists as well. And I want to take you to, as I go through some of the questions, I want to take you to the slide that has the information about the CPD credits, because we're really excited that we are now certified for HRPA credits for all of those human resource professionals out there who collect HRPA professional development credits. So you can see the information there. Again, we're certified for Ontario, Quebec. If you're in BC, there's more information. All of this is going to come in a follow-up email afterwards. So not to worry if you don't catch it just now, but I'll leave it up there while we go through some of the questions. So I guess I'll start it off with Naya. Naya, one question we had from the audience was resources for BC employers. Like, this is obviously new. Where can they go to find more information or resources about particular filing their or preparing their pay transparency reports?
Yeah, so I've answered a couple of different questions in the chat, and they should be accessible there. But my answer on that point is that the BC provincial government is a pretty good starting place on resources. They do share, examples of pay transparency reports and have frequently asked questions there about what to include in your report and how you could collect the necessary information to prepare your pay transparency report. There's also the reporting tool on their website that is a good starting point for if you need that support to prepare your report. And then, of course, there's legal counsel. So I've worked with many different employers on getting their gender information collected for the purposes of preparing the report, and then in actually preparing the report itself.
Another question for you on BC, because I think it's top of mind for a lot of employers. But what about private or let's say non-public postings? Are there any obligations that apply to those postings, like an internal only posting, for example, that I don't know? Well, you tell me.
So the Act only requires you to provide the pay information for publicly posted job opportunities. So no, you're not required to provide that information if it's not publicly posted. But again, given that the trend is towards increased transparency in that area, I would not be surprised if employees came to you asking about what the pay information is that is associated with that job posting.
Interesting. And someone's asked, I'll take this one, but someone's asked about the interaction between pay transparency in Ontario and pay equity in Ontario. And as it currently stands, they don't interact that much, because the Ontario requirement on the pay transparency front is really going to be about including expected compensation or expected compensation ranges. But that said, I think it's a really interesting question, because certainly pay equity is all about salary ranges, or typically you're using salary ranges to calculate the compensation rates. So if you don't have strong, like you can't, let's say, do a different, well, you could, but there could be implications is probably a better way to say it. Implications if you put a different salary range on a job posting versus what you use for preparing your pay equity plans. So again, it goes to that sort of need to have a more holistic view of your compensation practices and really ensure that they're sort of tight and well defined, because if you're using one thing for one purpose and one thing for another, it really could start getting you into trouble.
If I may, another point on this, we were talking about in our preparation, is that since Quebec and Ontario have proactive pay equity, it forces employer to be prepared and have a job evaluation tool and already have ranges for different job classes. So although, like as you explained, it's the obligations are a bit different. It helps being structured and prepared, and so that when it's the time to, if it happens, to be transparent regarding the rate of pay or salary bands, well, there's already a structure behind that the data.
Yeah.
And I don't want we'll leave time for other questions, but very interested. A consultant, I heard often the comment is that other than correcting wage gaps between male and female positions, Pay Equity Act also forces employers to have that structure behind the compensation, so helps prepare.
Yeah, and it's easy for us to stand up here and say, just, standardize your compensation practices.
Of course.
We know in practice, it's a lot of hard work, particularly for organizations that have more complex incentive programs and other sort of, variable compensation elements. It can be really, really challenging. And again, there are lots of good business reasons why you want to attract talent and remain competitive and all those kinds of things, but it can be at odds often with these formal regimes. So.
You're right that I make it seem easy, but there's a lot of work behind that.
Yeah. No, exactly. Naya, I want to get back to you with a couple questions about BC. So one question from the audience, and it looks like you may be answering this question in the chat. Yeah. So if you have already, forgive me. But for the rest of the audience, can you confirm, is there an ability to contract out if that obligation the prohibition on sharing information about compensation practices, can you contract out of that with individual employees?
So nothing in the legislation actually speaks, directly to whether you can put in, for example, a non-disclosure agreement saying you can't talk about your compensation information or anything like that. I certainly have been advising that you should not be going in that direction. That is obviously contrary to the intention of the legislation, and contrary, I'd say, if there's negative implications to the employee for talking about their compensation with others, then that is certainly contrary to the Pay Transparency Act. Again, I haven't, because this act is so new, we haven't really seen the implications of what could happen if an employer tried to prohibit this. But I wouldn't go that route. Right. It's certainly not the way that things are moving forward.
Interesting. And one clarification question too. So obviously under pay equity regimes, you've got an obligation to, where you identify a wage gap, to make proactive steps to correct that. Do I understand correctly that in BC, at least, where there's no pay equity, no private sector pay equity legislation, there's currently no proactive obligation to go and reduce, for example, any wage gaps that you might identify in your pay transparency report?
That's correct. The Pay Transparency Act does not require employers to actually take action on the pay gaps, but the pay reporting provisions are a way to kind of inspire employers to take that action. Because if you are year after year posting that your organization has, a significant gender pay gap, and there is no difference really in kind of the reporting over time, then there may be some, negative kind of public relations coming out of that, if that is pointed out by your employees, by the public generally.
Right. And the way I think of it too is pay transparency, it gives you sort of a snapshot, but it doesn't get into the nuance, right? It doesn't look at whether there's a merit-based compensation plan that actually justifies the different pay ranges or the different bonuses, for example. It doesn't look at employee seniority. It doesn't look at kind of all those other factors that when you're doing a pay equity analysis, where you actually do have to proactively make changes to compensation, you're allowed to take into account those relevant factors. So pay transparency, I think, it helps sort of illuminate, and it's instructive, but it's also got its real limitations. So we don't tend to see governments saying, okay, you're going to use your pay transparency data to actually make changes to or mandate, I guess, changes to compensation.
Yes. And I think the Pay Transparency Act, because it's just so new, and this is kind of like the first legislation of its kind, is maybe the government trying to feel out how can we get employers started on this, and then how can we build on this legislation in the future, maybe amend it, maybe add something else to advance that goal of gender pay equity. And I think ultimately the goal is pay equity for equity-seeking groups across the board, including on the basis of race, sexual orientation, et cetera.
Interesting. Well, I think we'll leave it at that for today, but we'll give a big thank you to our audience for joining us. I'm sure I have some closing remarks I'm supposed to make too, so bear with me. Some logistics. Yes. So I've already taken you to the slides here where you have the CPD information, but as I mentioned, we're going to have an email that will go out with that and to be able to access our materials as well. Because if you loved this presentation and want to share it with all of your colleagues, friends, family, you name it, you can visit the events section of fasken.com to replay it all. And yeah, please, again, I mentioned at the beginning of the survey, we'd love to hear from you. So please take the time if you have an extra few minutes, because we've given you back 10 minutes. So we'll take one extra one of those, please, to fill out the survey. And we look forward to seeing you again at our next presentations. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.